Ballarat is a city absolutely infested with cars, no doubt about that. But it really was not always that way. Almost every major city in the world was never car dependent from the start, even when those places had fractions of the population they do now. But Ballarat was growing rapidly since the gold rush in the 1850s, and a train line to Ballarat was seen as a massive priority. The line to Ballarat opened in 1862, running from Geelong. It was intended to be the main line for some time because planing through the Bacchus Marsh Hills was very difficult, and the final destination for travellers was Melbourne most of the time, not Geelong. Knowing that, there was not really any other choice other than to make passengers change at Geelong. In the following decades, branches and lines ran all across Western Victoria, mostly converging at Ballarat. These lines extended well past Ballarat to places like Mildura, Inglewood, Castlemaine, and Daylesford and Adelaide. The Grampians, Mount Gambier, Portland and Skipton among other places. In the 1890s, a direct line to Melbourne finally opened. It wasn't exactly fast, and there was an insane amount of stops, especially between Ballarat and Balan, which are now adjacent, with all the stations in between closing. While I will be not covering any more train lines except for the Buninyong Suburban Railway in this video, Ballarat's transport could not really get much better for a time, and when cars themselves were a niche and actually very useless and seen as dangerous amongst the public. The transport of Ballarat was not the same as it is now. It also started to open its tramways. The first being in 1887 from Sturt Street in the city to Lake Wendouree. The line was horse-drawn and the trams themselves were basically just bi-level carriages on rails, but branches and new lines started to places like Sebastopol, Drummond Street and Soldiers Hill. The Soldiers Hill line involved the construction of a tramway square on Lydiard Street, which slowed both trams and trains substantially. It would have been a lot cheaper than a city-altering level crossing removal, which wouldn't matter in the 21st century because of the interlocked gates being ploughed through by a train, which was literally the entire appeal of the level crossing. Since then, modern boom gates have been put in, so we now have a brand new eyesore that the government is trying to remove everywhere else in the state. Shiny new stupid boom gates aside, the trams weren't exactly frequent or fast, with a total of 19 carriage carts, trams, and around 50 horses between them. The network was predominantly single track with crossing loops few and far between. In 1907, the network became electrified, and this meant the extension of the Soldiers Hill line the rest of the way up Lydiard Street. The lines generally remained very short, only being short stubs that went 2 or 3 kilometres from the city itself. And the network looks absolutely pathetic by comparison to the current urban sprawl of Ballarat. And without trams to regulate traffic in outer suburban areas, it fails to provide a viable alternative to driving. The only mode of transport was and still is the stroads and buses whenever a driver or CDC worker decides to run a service. But I'll be talking more about modern suburban transport in another video, probably the next one. But to put it bluntly, public transport almost doesn't exist now. The network unfortunately has stagnated for some time, with all the trams being second or third generation and from other cities. Only the horse carts were built brand new and they weren't manufactured locally, being made in Adelaide. The frequency was never upped from half an hour, 20 minutes at peak, but services did run to 11 at night, every single night, which is absolutely not done now and probably won't be for a while. Around 1970, the city had a major choice: either upgrade the dilapidated tram network, extend the network for the new urban growth, and to duplicate the line with an actual frequency. This would have been the obvious choice, to also replace the entire fleet with something that isn't 60 years old and falling apart, probably like the Z-Class in Melbourne. The city thought about it for all of 2 seconds and came to the best decision possible. Nope, let's tear the bloody thing out. The last tram ran from Lydiard Street north to Sebastopol in 1972, and by that point buses were already replacing trams on weekends. The faster buses didn't have to compete for right-of-way within the vast expanses of single track, and lots of them actually had more capacity than the now ancient trams. When the trams were born and pretty much died, the far more expensive trains had a similar fate. Melbourne served as a massive interchange station, with more lines running into it than the current day Melbourne ever will. Almost everywhere in Western Victoria had a connection to Ballarat directly. Ballarat served as a long time tourist attraction for people in Melbourne. This worked like a rocket for keeping the growth of Ballarat, but also the growth of car dependency. Ballarat is still a dead-end city, even though it is growing. Nor the peak of the Victorian railways was in 1928, when the Great Depression was also about to peak. This also culminated after the Octopus Act was finished. The Octopus Act was a bill that was passed through Parliament to nearly double the railway network around 30 years prior, with dozens and dozens of railway lines, too many to name. These extended across the city and across regional lines like Horsham and Hamilton. While the railways had a captive audience that was literally the entire state, people weren't travelling from Bendigo to Kilmore every day, or Ararat to Geelong every day, and most of those lines ran through Ballarat, like the Buninyong, Skipton, Warborough or Daylesford lines. To be fair about the Daylesford line though, there was a far more direct line and went to Melbourne via Woodend on the Bendigo line. Cars were not confined to a schedule, they were not cut to a rail motor, and cars did not have to go on tracks. Cars can go anywhere. If a person wanted to go from Mount Blowhard to Clunes, they did not have to change at North Creswick. To put it simple, the train was a success as a viable alternative to climbing on the back of a horse. And now the horses didn't need to be used because they were slower and a little bit more inconvenient. Railways were treated as a business that should turn a profit. Obviously, because you shouldn't prey on everyone's need to travel and calling passengers customers like it's in Japan, like they tried to commercialize off of it. When there are so many train lines in urban areas and private operators, then yes, they might be customers. Victorian trains in regional areas have been privatised in certain occasions, like the West Coast Railway, which was the Warrnambool line, and the Overland, which is the Adelaide line, which has not been returned to the government yet. V-Line itself, which is the operator of the entire state network, had in fact been privatised back in the 2000s, along with the entire electric suburban network and their lines. Connex and M-Train were the two operators, and M-Train was run by National Express, the same private entity that took over V-Line. When National Express dissolved, that meant that the M-Train network in Melbourne was handed to the other private operator, Connex, but with V-Line, that it was handed back to the government. But to be fair, Connex also dissolved on the 30th of November 2009, and good riddance. But what does privatisation have to do with Ballarat? Well, the death of the railways was caused completely by their business model. Any line that was deemed unprofitable was treated like it was nothing, and it was cut down to the point that it became unusable. Then they could feel good about closing a line that operated at a massive loss. They did this with so many lines, cutting them down so much that it made the whole network artificially terrible. If they had have upgraded these lines instead, even the smallest towns could have had just enough ridership to keep them going. For example, the Skipton line. Skipton is a reasonably sized town in the southwest of Ballarat, and it made stops at Wendouree, Haddon, Smythesdale and Linton among others. Cars scared the railways, so they cut the service. Now everyone has no train to take. That doesn't mean they were always not happy with the train. It was just not unique. Almost everywhere in the States and Canada experienced the same fate, but I'm glad to see there's no Via Rail here. Ballarat was the Shinjuku of Victoria. Now the timetable looks like this. In the next video, I'll be covering modern public transport in Victoria, and just transport in general. See you in the next one.